Thank you for the organisers for inviting us here. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully over this next hour, I might not convert you to play cricket, but hopefully I'll inspire you to see the similarities between javelin throwing and cricket, and perhaps we can learn together and move things forward as sports. So the structure of this session is I'll do the first part of the presentation, and then Peter, who's one of my PhD students, will continue and talk about his current work in lower back injuries and fast bowling. And at the end of that, before you go to lunch, we're going to have a short demo session downstairs where if you would like to come and try bowling, that would be brilliant. And we'll see if maybe your 80-metre javelin throwers can become 80 mile an hour, 90 mile an hour fast bowlers. So we'll see how it goes. Let's see if this works. Okay, so I'm a sports biomechanist with a bit of motor control. And what are we? What do we do? We've seen lots of presentations talking about biomechanics. And what I try and do is give a mechanical understanding and explanation of movement in sport. So I use maths, but there won't be any equations in this presentation, or hopefully not too many. And I'm looking for factors that are important. Factors that are important to sports that are technique-based. So fast bowling and cricket, javelin, are both technique critical. And I'm looking for things that are either important from a performance point of view or are important from an injury perspective. And my philosophy would be that in both of those activities, there are some factors that really are critical for elite performance. All elite performers will do some of these things the same. And we've seen that when we've been talking about javelin throwing yesterday, delaying the bowling arm, a braced front leg, etc. But there are lots of other things that aren't so important. They're down to the individual, perhaps down to an individual coach's preference. They're not the critical factors. And what I want to do as a biomechanist is to understand that relationship and identify what really is important from both a performance and an injury perspective. So, in your world, you know all about javelin. As a biomechanist coming into a new sport, I don't know anything about javelin. I understand the principles, the mechanics of how things work, but unless I do some research, I'm not going to be able to help you improve sport. But over time, that relationship between a biomechanist and a coach, when you first start out, the coach knows more than the biomechanist. But over time, as the biomechanist learns and he knows the principles behind movement, they can start to work with a coach to hopefully move a sport forward. And that's what we've been doing in cricket over a long period. Okay. That was our musical interlude. We'll come back. So I thought, well, I can't have a whole javelin presentation without any biomechanics on javelin. And I think Dave Parker, if he's still in the room, I think this was from his master's project. I found a video clip at Loughborough. So this is at the High Performance Centre at Loughborough. This was probably over 10 years ago, collecting some data on some javelin throwers. But that's the only bit of javelin biomechanics I'm going to show you. But I am going to try to bridge that link by showing you a comparison. So here, we'll start with a video of javelin. And you know all about this, and you'll be able to tell me whether this is good or bad technique. It's going very slowly. It's nice. And here's a fast bowler bowling the cricket ball about 160 grams over 90 mile an hour. Well, if we look at front foot contact, these two positions aren't that dissimilar. Both have a run-up, both get into a sort of similar position. Braced front leg, delayed bowling arm, delayed javelin. And by ball release or javelin release, again, the shapes aren't that dissimilar. The bowler's bowling the ball down, the javelin throwers throwing the javelin in the air. But the same sort of shapes we see in both. And then we also see the same sort of injuries. So how can we learn from one to the other? So, back in about 2004, I'm going to take you on a little journey from where we've gone from 2004 through to the present day. And Pete will finish off with where we are now. We've been working with England Welsh Cricket Board. So, what does fast bowling look like? Bowlers run up. It's about 7 meters per second. So they're not sprinting, and perhaps not dissimilar, but they're running up So slightly different, obviously, to javelin. They jump up into the delivery stride. Back foot contact, not too much going on, but throw into the business end of the movement, front foot contact, with a straight arm, deliver the ball between 80 and 90 mile an hour. So there are some similarities and some differences. And what's important in cricket, in fast bowling? It's dead simple, really. Bowl fast and accurately and don't get injured. If we can achieve those things, we're going to win. But in 2004, when we got involved, over 60%, between 60 and 70% of the fast bowlers in England, the top end, were getting injured. They're breaking down. They couldn't perform. And these were very problematic injuries because they were taking a bowler out for a season. So Peter will talk more about it later, but lumbar stress fractures causing a whole loss of a season from playing. And it was causing a tremendous problem because if you're injured, you can't play. And at that time, there'd been about 20 years of research. But it all focused on what I'll show you in the next few slides, a classification of bowling based out of work in Australia that was based on simple video cameras, because that was the technology then, at something called back foot contact. And that had been linked to injuries. But the injury rates were still very high. And the story about how this looks is that here's two bowlers at back foot contact, so they've run up and they've jumped into this position. And they were classified in different ways. So here, the bowler on the left is side on, his shoulders and his hips are pointing towards us. The bowler on the right is more front on, slightly more front on, not completely, so he's classed as midway. But if we move those two bowlers forward from there to just before front foot contact, you'll see the bowler on the right has become side on now. They're both in a similar position. So he's changed his orientation. So he was classed as mixed. And mixed was the injury word in cricket for a long period. The bowler on the left has stayed side on. But notice the front foot is still in the air. So there's no big force coming up through the body. But we get to front foot contact when there are large forces coming up through the body, and we'll see that later. They're in actually a similar position. So even though this bowler would have been classed as being more likely to get injured, if we looked at these two positions, you'd probably think this bowler is in a more awkward position than the bowler on the right. But this guy would have been said, you're not going to get injured, you're more likely to. It didn't make sense. So the injury mechanisms at that point in time, back in the mid-2000s, weren't well understood. And this mixed action that had been labelled as really problematic was defined very early in the bowling action when there wasn't much happening. And we were still getting high injury rates. Too many bowlers were breaking down. So the ECB, which is based at Loughborough University campus, came on board and they said, we'll fund some research. Let's do an investigation. Let's see if we can find out what's going on. How can we reduce these injury rates? Well, as a biomechanist, I like questions to answer. So I asked these, what are the questions? And over the next sort of 8-year period, 3 questions which I'm going to share with you today, and what we found out became apparent. So what technique factors within the bowling action are going to be linked to lower back injuries? Alongside that, you can't have a bowler that's not going to get injured if he can't perform. So we need to understand performance at the same time. And then this last question came out of the research. Do you actually need high forces to bowl fast? Or how does it link together? And there was a curious result that came out of that. So this is my environment. This is the National Cricket Performance Centre at Loughborough, converted into a biomechanics lab. So I set up about 25 cameras to accurately track what the bowler does during his performance. So it's my lab, but in their environment. So we use a Vicon system. This essentially tracks the kinematics of how someone moves, and we'll see how that works in due course. And we also have a force plate to measure the interaction between the bowler and the ground. So we're fortunate we get access to some of the best bowlers in the world, and if there's any cricketers in the room, they'll recognise this as Jimmy Anderson, the best English fast bowler ever, pretty much. And he looks particularly happy at this point because we've dotted him up, ready for emotion analysis as a biomechanist. Well, what happens? they run up and bowl. They do what they do best, which is bowl fast. And what we see, we don't see him, we just see the markers. So we start to have, and we can track these markers to around 1 millimeter accuracy. The markers move around a bit on the skin, but we still get pretty accurate kinematic information. We then make it look a bit more humanoid-like. We drop a skeleton because we know where we've put those markers. And then we can make it look a bit more like cricket. So at this point, we're able to accurately track what people do when they're performing. We give simple reports back to coaches, looking at, if we track a bowler over a few-year period, how their technique might have changed. Is the things the coach has been working on had any difference, etc. So, that's the process. What about the questions that we were interested in? What technique factors are likely to be linked to lower back injuries? And injuries are tough for a biomechanist because you can have the best technique in the world and still get injured. So as a biomechanist, I will go to the point of saying what factors are likely to have caused increased loading on the body, not take that next jump, which is injuries. Because you can have the best technique, bowl too much and still get injured. So we have to understand that relationship. So from my perspective, from an injury perspective, I'm looking for factors that have put increased load on the body. Well, not really any maths, but I'm going to put some reference frames in the back. I'm going to look at how parts of the body are moving relative to each other. So I'm looking at flexion, extension, side flexion, and rotation within the spine. Well, a simple starting point is to say passively, how much movement has a bowler got in the different directions? So with all the markers set put on, we can calculate the ranges of motion in each of the 3 directions. So flexion, extension, rotation to the sides, and flexing over one hip and the other. So if we look at that passively, under control conditions, and compare it to what happens in bowling, what do we find? We find that in one direction, side flexion to the non-bowling side, we get a huge increase here. So all fast bowlers do it, they all side flex over to the side. And we get this peak here that's about 50% more than they do naturally, putting a lot of strain through the lower back. So here's a graph of a typical trial. Back foot contact, beginning of the bowling action, through to ball release, and front foot contact just here. And front foot contact, when the front foot goes down, occurs typically just before we hit this peak. Well, at that point in time, so here's a side-on video. Here's the force plate in the ground. Front foot comes down. Some bowlers up to 8 times body weight going up their front leg. So we've got this side flex position, putting the back in an awkward position. We've got, for some bowlers, 8 times body weight coming up through the front leg. Not particularly good for you. So what does it look like here? Peaks in the forces. So, in about 2008, 2009, the thinking was, it's got nothing to do with mixed actions and back foot contact. Injury mechanisms, what's causing the loading, what's likely to be causing the injuries, it's high force and this poor side flex position that's going to be the main risk factor from a technical perspective to lower back injuries. But all bowlers have relatively high force, and all bowlers get into a side flex position. So the unanswered questions at that point, which is what Peter's going to hopefully answer in the future, is how much force or side flexion is too much? At what point should you be concerned as a coach that your player is side flexing too much, or that the forces going through the front leg are too high? And that's the unanswered bit that we don't know yet. So I'm going to give you 2 case studies of 2 high-profile English bowlers, and how they were treated quite differently. First one, this is a young Stuart Broad. You can't really tell from here, but hopefully we'll see in the next few slides. Getting into this horrible position at front foot contact. His foot's down on the ground, high force going up through his body, and this isn't going to last very long. He's going to snap. So we had that conversation with him and said, you know, your career isn't going to last very long if you continue to bowl like this. So he went through a process of trying to learn to bowl in a different way. And I'm no coach, but this was all about trying to get him to stay up more upright, still perform his skill. And because he was young enough, he was able to change. And he's become probably the number 2 bowler now, playing out in India at the moment. Successful, really successful cricket career, bowling fast and not breaking down. So there was an example of where we'd changed, in conjunction with the coaches, based on the information we knew, changed this guy's bowling action to help him stay injury-free. But I'm going to contrast that now with the best bowler England's produced in recent times, Jimmy Anderson. He had a career-threatening stress fracture, and they decided to change his bowling action. This was predating the work that we did, but they changed his bowling action, but he couldn't perform anymore. He became a county player. He wasn't world-class anymore. He'd lost his skill, so it didn't work for him. So we went back with him and tried to get him to bowl and cope with manage his injuries in a different way, tried to get him back to bowling how he did. That was what made him world-class. That was his point of difference. He had complete control over the ball. He knew what he was doing. So for him, it wasn't about changing his bowling action. It was about the skill was more important, and then would manage the injury situation afterwards. So there isn't one solution for it all players. It has to be work with the individual, see what's going to work for them. Number one is they have to perform. So over the last 5 or 6 years, the emphasis within England cricket has not been about changing bowling actions to allow them to not be injured. It's been about, number one, performing, and number two, manage injuries or work with the player. Because if they don't perform, they're no good to anybody. So that leads very nicely on to what characterises the fastest bowlers. If we take a group of fast bowlers, are there some things that they all do? Are there some things that are common, the common elements across all of them? Well, listening to the guys on javelin yesterday, certainly running up quick has come out as an important variable. Well, it's true in fast bowling too. There is a limit though. If you run up too fast, your performance will deteriorate. But in fast bowling, a good run-up, an appropriate run-up, is clearly important. The challenge is knowing what's optimum. The second factor that comes out, so here's 2 typical bowlers at front foot contact. This guy has the potential to play for England. This guy's going to be a county player. He's not bowling quick enough. Bowling at 75 mile an hour isn't going to get you in the England team. Bowling at 85 mile an hour is. The faster bowlers typically delay their bowling arm. At this point in the bowling action, when the foot comes down, their arm is less far through their action. Second factor that was important across all the quicker bowlers. The third factor was, between front foot contact and ball release, the bowlers that bowled fastest had pulled their trunk through a bigger range of motion in this period of time. They'd moved their trunk through a bigger angle between front foot contact, the picture on the left, through to ball release. And the last factor that was common across a range of bowlers, irrespective of size, strength, or anything else, was at ball release, the quick bowlers had straight front leg, the slower bowlers had collapsed. So these were 4 technical factors that was common and linked to fast bowling. The fast bowlers did all of these things. Well, how good is that prediction? Those 4 variables on their own, irrespective of anything else, how strong they are, how tall they are, or anything else, how good is this prediction between what they can actually do and what they could predict, what we would predict based on those 4 variables? Well, if it was perfect, we'd get the line y equals x. Their actual speed would be completely correlated with predicted. Well, it's not that, but it does look like that. 3/4 of the variance in pace across a cohort of fast bowlers was explained by just 4 variables. 4 variables that was common across the whole group. And these are the variables that we think are critical to performance in fast bowling. The quickest bowler, interestingly, bowls faster than what we'd predict. Something's different there. But he happens to be the most powerful bowler too. So it would appear that he gets more out of his bowling action than the technique would on its own would explain due to other factors, and we think that's down to strength. So quite a powerful argument. And this sort of information is used now to talent ID. Look for bowlers with these attributes. Not necessarily about coaching it yet, but look for these. If you've got these attributes, nurture them and use them. Yeah? Look for these in bowlers. And then shapes. Coaches talk about shapes. And so with the England coaches, we often look for this sort of shape. Faster bowlers look like this. They're not pulling their arm through, they're pulling their trunk through and leaving their arm behind them. The ones that are slower are pulling their arm through actively. They're quite different shapes. And put it together, you can start to see those attributes that are linked to pace. So the last question I'm going to talk about is, do we need high forces to bowl fast? Is it inevitable that the fastest bowlers are also producing the most force and therefore the most likely to get injured perhaps? So we've seen this clip already. We've got high force coming up through the body at front foot contact. Big spike in the force. Well, if we look at a force trace, there are some different parts of it that we could pull out, rather than look at all the numbers. We could look at how big is the force, what's the peak, what's the loading rate, how quickly do we get to peak force, because that's often been linked to injuries. And thirdly, what's the overall amount? For any biomechanists in the room, what's the impulse? Add up all the force over a period of time. 3 quantities that we can look at. Well, if we look at a typical slower and faster bowler within that cohort, what do we see? And these forces are expressed as a proportion of their own body weight, so we can compare between different people. So we've got a typical faster bowler on the right in that group, and a typical slower bowler. Well, what do we find? Surprisingly, the faster bowlers actually have lower peak forces. We didn't expect that. They have lower loading rates. We didn't expect that either. But what they do have is they have a larger overall amount of braking force. So when that front foot hits the ground, so these graphs are from front foot contact through to ball release, quicker bowlers have a larger overall amount of braking force, even though the peaks are typically a lot smaller. Well, does that make sense? So this overall amount, well, essentially by having a larger overall amount of force, you're slowing the mass centre down. So you put in the brakes on when you hit the ground, slowing the mass centre down and allowing the rest of the body to come over the top. And this was linked to stride length. The quicker bowlers had a larger stride length. And if you think of it in simple terms, to keep this area of the triangle the same, if you've got a shorter contact time because you're further through the reaction, you've got a shorter stride length, you need a much higher peak to get the same area. If you've got a longer contact time, by having a larger stride length, you can have a lower peak and still get the same overall amount. And this was linked, not all bowlers do this, but many do, by having a larger stride length, they end up with a heel strike technique rather than a mid-front or forefront technique. And that gives you lower loading and lower peaks. So, over those 3 questions, what we've done with biomechanics is try to give a mechanical understanding of what's important to fast bowling. And hopefully you can see the similarities to javelin. So we've got some characteristics for the fast bowlers from both a performance and an injury perspective that are linked to this sort of shape. This is what we like to see. Not everyone's the same, but this sort of general shape. Okay, so I started with javelin. perhaps now when you look at this, you can think, do I see these sort of characteristics? What are the similarities between javelin throwing and fast bowling? I think there are lots, and indeed you see the same sort of injuries. Okay, thank you, and we're going to have a quick changeover to Peter.